On a Friday evening, after a hectic week, I wanted to treat myself to dinner out. I had recently moved to the city and decided to eat at a restaurant everyone recommended. Its location was near the city center, on a somewhat narrow and deserted street, but that wasn't a major issue for me. When I entered the restaurant, a dimly lit ambience with soft jazz playing in the background felt quite welcoming. I chose a table for myself and started looking through the menu. However, while trying to decide on a dish, I noticed a middle-aged man from a table opposite me who kept staring at me. Every time I looked, he would look away, but then his gaze would return to me. Initially, I didn't think much of it. Maybe I reminded him of someone he once knew. I ordered my food and started eating, but his eyes were still on me. After a while, I noticed him approaching. "Hello," he said with a shaky voice. "Do I look familiar to you?" I felt a bit uneasy from the tone of his voice and responded, "I don't believe we've met before." He seemed a little upset and replied, "I'm sorry," then returned to his table. By the time I finished my meal, I glanced over at his table again to find he had left. I exited the restaurant and began walking home. As I walked, I occasionally checked behind me, as a gut feeling told me he might be following. After walking a few blocks, I began to hear footsteps. As I quickened my pace, so did the steps. Growing fearful, I hailed a cab. As the taxi drove me home, I looked back to see the man still following me from a distance. When I arrived home, I locked the door immediately and drew the curtains. I pondered on what to do next and eventually decided to call the police. When they arrived, they found no one around. Days passed, and I began to put that night behind me. Until one day, I found a note in front of my house. It read, "Until we meet again." After that incident, I never went to that restaurant again and avoided that part of the city center for some time. I never learned who the man was or what he wanted, but one thing was certain: I never wanted to encounter him again. On a Friday evening, after my journey home from work, I felt tired and hungry. Therefore, I decided to go to a newly opened upscale restaurant in the city. The interior of the restaurant was quite dark, located in a historic building, which gave it a mystical ambience. Upon entering the restaurant, I caught a glimpse of a man with long black hair and a pale face, sitting in a corner lit by candlelight. Our eyes met, and I felt a chill, but initially attributed this feeling to my fatigue. After I sat down, I began browsing the menu. However, I couldn't shake off the man's gaze. Shortly after ordering my food, he approached and asked, "Hello, may I join you?" I politely declined his offer, but he insisted and sat down anyway. As we began to converse, the stories he shared were quite peculiar. He spoke of experiences from his past, but these experiences dated back 100 years. As I listened, a growing sense of fear welled up inside me. This is impossible, I thought. But the deep lines on his face and his seemingly old-fashioned attire seemed to corroborate his tales. By the end of my meal, I told him I needed to leave. However, he didn't want me to go. He persistently asked, "Can I have your phone number?" When I declined, his expression darkened even further, and he said, "I want to see you again." As I left the restaurant, I felt he was following me. I quickly made my way to my car, but upon reaching it, I saw his reflection in the back seat. When I turned around in fear, there was no one there. I quickly started my car and drove home. When I got home, I checked and locked all the doors and windows. However, that night, I heard strange noises inside the house. The rustling of the curtains with the wind seemed to whisper in the stillness of the night. I couldn't sleep throughout the night. In the morning, I found a note left on my door. It read, "Until we meet again," and next to the note was an old-fashioned brooch, the same kind he wore that night at the restaurant. After that incident, I never returned to that restaurant and even considered moving cities. I never found out who the man was or what he wanted, but that encounter remains the most terrifying memory of my life. When I moved to a big city to turn a new page in my life, all I expected was a fresh start. I immediately started job hunting and soon began working as a waiter in an old historic restaurant in the city center. The restaurant, with its old stone walls, wooden tables, and warm atmosphere, instantly caught my attention. My boss, the owner of the restaurant, was a middle-aged, friendly man. However, in the corner of the restaurant, he had a 7-year-old son who always sat quietly, not talking to anyone. The initial days went by with the excitement of my new job. I attended to customers, took orders, and served dishes. However, every day, the son of my boss drew more and more of my attention. In the corner where he sat, he was always engrossed in a notebook, sketching. Some days he'd smile at me, but at times there was an inexplicable expression in his eyes. One day, he approached me during service and uttered some words while clutching my leg. "The shadows are coming. Time is near." At first, these words seemed meaningless, but the seriousness in the boy's eyes deeply unsettled me. A few days later, my curiosity got the better of me, and I approached the boy's table. He was in the restroom, and his notebook lay open. I began to peruse the sketches. The notebook was filled with odd symbols, strange shapes, and scribbled writings. What struck me most was a symbol of triangles converging in a circular manner. It felt familiar, but I couldn't pinpoint from where. That night, I fell into a deep sleep almost immediately upon hitting the bed. However, my dreams were filled with the symbols from the notebook. In the dream, I found myself in a large old hall, face to face with my boss's son. He extended the notebook towards me. The pages started flipping rapidly, and the symbols I saw began to manifest around me. Then I heard those words he said, but this time they were more sinister and felt real. I woke up drenched in sweat. The next day when I arrived at work, my boss's son was waiting for me. He opened his notebook and showed it to me. There was the dream I had seen the previous night, the symbols, but the most terrifying part was a sketch done while I was asleep. It depicted shadowy figures watching me as I slept. After this incident, I immediately quit my job. However, I never forgot the mysteries hidden by that restaurant and the owner's son. I never stepped foot in that restaurant again, but those symbols and words remained with me for the rest of my life.